There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. It's with these words that an ancient worship song celebrated the presence of God as he dwelt in Jerusalem. The holy place that the psalmist talks about was the temple. And river symbolized God's life-giving power and provision. Now, some years later, a prophet named Ezekiel had a vision of a restored temple in a restored Jerusalem after the city had been destroyed. And most of all, he had a vision of the renewed presence of God. Therefore, he sees a river flowing from the temple's gates. We read in Ezekiel 47:1, "The man brought me back," this is in his vision, "to the entrance of the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar." This river begins in his vision as a trickle, but it grows wider, it grows deeper, bringing healing to the entire land, so that he says in verse 12, "Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Every month they will bear fruit, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing." It's this same river of life that the prophet John sees in his final vision of Revelation, all the way at the very, very end of your Bible. Having seen God's dwelling, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, he then says in Revelation 22, verses 1-3, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him." We live in a thirsty world. Ashley's story talked about a young lady going off to college, being thirsty, being hungry, being confused, looking for whatever it was that would really make her life meaningful. You heard her story. We all live in that thirsty world. How wonderful it would be to have a drink from the river that John describes, from the river that Ezekiel saw in his vision, from the river that the psalmist said makes glad the city of God. Where are you thirsty right now? Where in your life are you thirsty? I don't necessarily mean physically, but spiritually, maybe emotionally. Some place in your life where it would be like a glass of ice cold water. If God would come and would just do something in that area to heal that problem, to restore that relationship, to answer that deep doubt, to set you free from something that was holding you back. Where are you thirsty? Where's our community thirsty? I know Brian and Tammy have dedicated very much of their lives to just the area where they live with Rise Up Vermont, because it's a thirsty place. It's thirsty to the point where people don't even know how thirsty they are, and where people drink out of the wrong pools to try to find something to slake that thirst. Where are you thirsty? What would it feel like to have God quench that deep thirst? What would it feel like? Not just what would you think, but how would you feel if God came and quenched that thirst that nothing in this world can even begin to touch? John tells us that in his travels, Jesus' journey took him to a village in the neighboring province of Samaria. John chapter 4, verse 4 begins, "Now he had to go through Samaria, so he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. Now, while Jesus is sitting by the well, a woman comes, as you probably know the story if you've read the Gospel of John. A Samaritan woman came out of the nearby village. And this is an interesting meeting that's going to take place. In chapter 3, as we saw last week, Jesus had a meeting with a Jewish dignitary named Nicodemus. It happened at night. It was a meeting that was just filled with misunderstanding and with a clouded conversation. And the last words we have from Nicodemus in that particular conversation are, "How can this be?" He's completely lost. The fact that this meeting was at night might be John's way of saying Nicodemus, as educated and as religious as he was still fumbling around in the dark. The next meeting that we find in the Gospel of John happens in broad daylight with the sun right overhead at high noon. Will this woman see something that Nicodemus didn't? What's going to happen? Will the sunshine of God's presence and love shine into the heart of a foreigner living in a land that Jews didn't even consider worthy of any respect? Well, the encounter begins with Jesus asking for a drink of water. And the woman is shocked at his boldness. She says in verse 9, "You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman." Now in that language, when she said Jew, she used the masculine. So she's saying, "You're a Jewish man and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Huge gaps here. First of all, there was a gender gap. Jewish men weren't supposed to speak to any woman other than a family member, certainly not out on the street, because people would take it the wrong way. Secondly, there was an ethnic gap. Jews and Samaritans didn't just not get along, they completely hated each other. They were just close enough in terms of their religious backgrounds that they were extremely offended by how the other people had changed the true religion. And so they were always at war. In fact, at times they would burn down each other's temples or try to stop each other from building their cities. They were in enmity. Jewish people were told never to even use any utensil that a Samaritan had ever touched or used. So here's Jesus, a Jewish man, saying to a Samaritan woman, "Can I borrow your pitcher and have a drink of water? Can I drink out of that thing that you carry around, that you use all the time?" She has no grid for where he's coming from. Jesus, however, doesn't answer her question. Instead, he offers her a drink himself. Verse 10, Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." If you knew. If you knew. This isn't really a conversation about Jews and Samaritans, you see. It's not a conversation about how men and women relate to each other in a Middle Eastern culture. It's a conversation about the river of the water of life that flows from the very presence of the Father. It's a conversation about the river that Ezekiel saw. It's about the river that the psalmist talked about when he said, "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God." It's a conversation about the river that the prophet John sees at the very end of the Bible. When he sees the whole world come together, heaven and earth joined the way it was always meant to be, and a river of healing flows out of the presence of God. And Jesus is saying, "Would you like a drink from that water?" Now, again, as with so often in the Gospel of John, there's a problem. The idea of living water had two meanings. It had a horizontal meaning, and it had a vertical meaning. The horizontal meaning was pretty simple. Living water was flowing water, moving water, as opposed to stagnant water. So Jesus is saying, is they're at a well, and the water down there might have been there for a while, who knows? He's saying, how would you like something that's moving, living water? And she, of course, thinking horizontally like Nicodemus, stumbles into thinking that he's offering her a drink of water when this whole conversation began with him asking for her for water because they're sitting in front of a deep, deep well. So she objects, "You don't have a rope, you don't have a bucket, you can't get anything out of this well. How are you going to give me living, flowing water? There are no streams around here." And then she pushes it one step further and she says, "Do you think you're greater than Jacob, the patriarch of the Jewish and Samaritan people? He, after all, dug this well. It's his gift of water." This is the closest thing in her world, you see, to the river of life. The water in that well came all the way back from Jacob, the father of their entire their tribe. And so every time you drank of that water, you were getting a little bit of a gift from Father Jacob and his blessing. Jesus says to her, I'll make you a promise of something infinitely more wonderful than Jacob's well. Verse 13, Jesus answered, everybody who drinks this water, you can see him pointing down the hole of the well, everybody who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Jesus isn't talking horizontally. He's very frank about that. Well, if you just want to talk about water in this world, yes, you can have a drink of water today at 12 noon, and by 1 o'clock, you're going to be thirsty again. And tomorrow, you'll be right back at this well, pulling water out to take it home and trying to make it last until the next day. But he said, I'm not talking about that kind of living water. I'm talking about water that gives life from heaven itself. Living water as something that goes in a totally different direction. You see, horizontal thinking versus vertical thinking. We live in a horizontal world. We connect everything to everything else that we know. And like the woman at the well, she's hearing this tremendous promise, but all she can do is try to squeeze it into her world. And Jesus said, don't think that way, think this way. I'm going to give you the water of life, the water that flows from the very presence of God. Now, of course, she's not there yet. She doesn't really get where he's going. So she says in verse 15, well, sir, give me this water so that I won't be thirsty. I won't have to keep coming here to draw water. You can see there are like two different levels here. Jesus is nudging her into a conversation that will bring her into God's own presence. She keeps flattening it out into just the nitty-gritty of everyday life. You'll never find the river of the water of life if you insist on thinking horizontally. Just as hard for you and me to drink from that wonderful river as it was for the Samaritan woman. I asked you a few moments ago to think about a place in your life where you're thirsty, where there's that deep, deep thirst that only God can fill. And the reality is that there'll be many, many things in this life that we will think will quench that thirst, and may actually quench it for a minute. But then the thirst comes back. Like Jesus said, you keep drinking from the pools of this world, and you'll be thirsty again. You'll be thirsty again. I remember when I was overseas, I had a chance to eat sugarcane. Anybody ever had sugarcane? A few of you. What I found with sugarcane was it tasted sweet, and it just kept trying to get the good feeling, and it just never worked. And you keep chewing, and we'd work on that, and it was, it's sweet, but then it just left you kind of wanting more, but not wanting, right? It just wasn't satisfactory. I wondered how often we chase the sugarcane of this world. We drink out of the pools of this world. We look at those pools and we know, that isn't probably really good for me, but it's better than nothing. And that's where this woman was at. That's where you and I can find ourselves at. Even if we've walked with Jesus for a long time, there'll still be another day, another situation where we're thirsty. And our first instinct is probably going to be to look around to see how we can try to quench that thirst. Just like this poor woman who had no idea that the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords was holding out the gift of living water. Now you see, to find the river, you have to know not only what God is giving, but remember what Jesus said to her? Who it is that's giving it to you. If you knew who it is, to find it, you have to know who. To quench the thirst, you don't need to find the well. You don't need to find the magic potion. You need to find the one who gives. Because in this vertical way of thinking, you need to follow the river to its source. It flows from the very presence of God. So to help her discover who he is, Jesus gives her a glimpse of his glory. He tells her to go get her husband and bring him back. She says that she's not married. He says, well, that's true. You've said the truth. You've been married 5 times, and the person you're living with now isn't your husband. So yes, you have told the truth. which of course leaves her absolutely dumbfounded. There's no way this guy could have possibly known anything like that about her. And so her response is, well, I can see that you are a prophet. It didn't take a whole lot, did it? But that was a big deal in their culture. However, she's still stuck in that horizontal thinking, still trying to squeeze Jesus and this whole conversation into her familiar world. So she retreats into the old, tired religious distinctions that divided Jews and Samaritans. You may be a prophet, but you're a Jewish prophet, and I'm a Samaritan. So you're over there, and I'm over here. Jesus refuses to have anything to do with it. Instead, he makes an astounding statement. He says to her in verse 21, "Woman," which was, again, as in the story of the water turned to wine, not a disrespectful comment, but just sort of like saying, "Ma'am, woman, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth." The Samaritans had a form of Jewish religion, sort of Jewish. They used the same Bible, kind of, had some of the same rituals, but they had their own temple on a mountain called Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim was right above Jacob's well. So as they were having this conversation, this woman could look up and say, "We worship on this mountain," because it was right there in back of her. And she could say, "And you, Jews, you worship in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount in Zion." So he said, we each have our own place. We have our own mountain, and we both each believe that God is present on that place and that his blessings flow down. Jesus says, the time is coming and is now here when neither your mountain nor my mountain will matter. When God will no longer be localized in a temple. When we won't have to worry about what our ethnicity is in order to get to God. He's saying the river that flows from the presence of God is already in full flood. And it isn't coming from either temple. It's not coming from your hill. It's not coming from our hill. It's available as my personal gift, not only to Jewish people, but to you, a Samaritan woman, and the whole world as well. That's vertical thinking. You never would get there with horizontal thinking. You would never get there by comparing theologies or by having an argument. You see, because it didn't come from something people figured out. It came from a person being present. Jesus had to be there, come from heaven as the Son, the Word made flesh, to stand right there and to say, "Here comes the river you've been waiting for all along." And oh yes, for a while it trickled out of Mount Zion, the Jewish place. Or maybe you thought it was coming from your mountain, Mount Gerizim. We've all been looking and searching, but now it is coming as my gift to the whole world. The experience of the presence of God. True worship will now happen not in a temple, but in here. Because he says, the river is not just going to be a gift to you, it's going to flow out of you. The Samaritan woman hears this, and I think at this point she's starting to go vertical. And she states her greatest hope. She says in verse 25, "I know that Messiah, called the Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." You see, no longer is she now saying, "Well, I have my point of view, and you have your point of view." Or, "Well, you're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan. Well, you're a man, well, I'm a woman. Well, we worship on our hill, and you worship on our..." Now she's expressing a hope. She's expressing her deepest thirst. What do you want the most? You've tried everything, lady. You've tried the marriages, and 5 times it didn't work. You've given up on that. You're no longer able to even come to the well with the other women of the village because they don't like to be around you. So here you are at high noon, and you stumble into a conversation with this strange Jewish man from wherever who's talking to you about the river of life. What are you thirsty for? And her thirst comes out. we know that someday the Messiah will come. Someday God will send the person who brings his presence. Someday the river will come. And when Messiah comes, he'll explain everything in it. Everything to us. And then Jesus answers her, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. Your long wait is over. The great I am, the one true God, is present, offering you living water. He's saying the water's already around your ankles. It's already rising up all around you. Because you see, the river isn't about what God will do. It's about who God is when he comes into your life. Oh, to have a drink of that living water. The good news is that Jesus' offer is just as valid for you and me as it was at Jacob's well. He's the one who said in John chapter 7, verse 37, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures have said, rivers of living water will flow from within them. By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. That offer of living water that Jesus gave to that woman there at noonday in a hot, dusty well outside the city of Sychar is just as valid for you and for me as it was for her at that moment. You see, it is no longer about who we know, where we're from, what our background is, what our religious tradition might have been. It's no longer about horizontal categories, about who has the best edge and who has maybe the most knowledge or who has the most money or who has the best background. It's not about any of those things. It's not about us going out on a quest to quench our thirst. It's about Jesus coming into our lives, welcoming him and letting him put the fountain on the inside of us. Whoever drinks of this water will never be thirsty again. Remember I mentioned that Nicodemus met with Jesus in the middle of the night, a time of ignorance and confusion and darkness. This conversation was happening in broad daylight at high noon. Well, when the woman heard Jesus say, you're looking for the Messiah, I am he, she went off to her village. She brought the whole village back. When she met the village, she said, I met a man who told me everything that I ever did. Could this be the Christ? And they all came back and they all came to faith in Jesus. They all stepped into the river of living water. And they all had that thirst quenched by this strange meeting that you would have thought never should have happened, but did happen because God put his son Jesus there at a well on a hot day at high noon. He wants to do that for you, no matter how high the sun is. Yesterday, we all had a chance to experience what it's like to be hot and thirsty. If you stepped out of your house for 5 minutes, you probably figured that one out. But even in your own life right now, where's that place where you're thirsty? Where's that place where only the river of God, the river of life that he's promised will one day fill the whole world, only that river can quench it? I'm going to ask you to bow your head together with me. Sam DeFranco and her prayer team are going to come up front here, and then they're going to come back and they're going to find you and pray with you. You'll make it easier for them even if with your head bowed and your eyes closed and you'd like someone to pray with you, if you would just maybe slip your hand up and then they can come to you. They certainly might come if they feel drawn to someone, but we'd like to make it a lot more intentional for them. So let's bow our heads together. And I'm going to ask them to be watching. If you raise your hand or if you signal them that you would like to have prayer. Father, we are here as thirsty people. Lord, your word says, blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. So, Lord, in those places where we're thirsty today, where we need a miracle from you, where we need healing, where we need you, Lord, to pour the water of life into a dry place and bring it back to life. Lord, a place where we need your strength, your comfort, where we need your courage, where we need to have our faith refreshed, where we need to find you, maybe for the very first time. I ask you to give us the boldness to do what this woman did and to step into the river of the water of life by welcoming you into our space right now. We thank you, Lord. I'm going to ask if you just would raise your hand if you have a prayer need this morning. Anybody? Don't be in here. We have one down front here. Anybody else? Any special needs? Maybe there's somebody in your family, maybe there's somebody in your life that is going through a hard time right now. Maybe you need a touch for healing. Maybe it's just something you don't even want to have to talk about, but you could at least just have someone pray. You feel free to share or not share anything. Let's stand together, and we're going to sing together. And again, if you have a need for prayer and you want to come down, we'd love to have you come down.